we have the Australian National University 2. The Australian National University, we have ANU1. Okay. And as you can see on the screen, the motion for today's debate is that we prefer a world where all human beings cease to feel disgust. Okay, good luck to both teams. I'm going to take a seat over there. Hopefully this mic doesn't echo and whatnot standing back there. If it does, I'll ask you to stand up for each speech on your own. But otherwise, once I'm seated over there, I welcome the first affirmative to open the debate.
Yep. Tried speaking.
Oh, like, can everyone hear me?
Maybe move it a bit closer.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
How? A world where people use disgust to justify discrimination and homophobia. A world where people use it to not help other peoples. It was a particularly good thing that humans cease to feel disgust. 3 things in the speech. Firstly, a little bit on the setup, then on why we were able to get a kinder society, and why moral judgments were better in our world. Firstly, a little bit of setup. Obviously, this is a prefer a world version. However, we don't really know if it's retrospective because it does say cease to exist. So we're going to present our case as if it wasn't retrospective, but obviously all our benefits would extend if it was. Second, what does disgust look like? Firstly, it's probably something of physical sensation, also a mental sensation that people have. Sometimes it's an irrational fear on an individual level, but often it's probably things that society has conditioned. So like there are particular things that people feel disgust towards. At the end of this debate, we'll prove why both things are quite bad and how we're able to fix this as a whole. Firstly, why do we get a kind of society? 1, because we get better rights for people. Often, the way people talk about things like homophobia and things like that is through the framing of disgust, having like a physical reaction to things like that. Obviously, they frame it as having quite a strong sensation, something that they can't really control, and that just means that it makes people view it as inherently immoral because they have such a physical reaction, because it is hard to understand it on any other level. And at the end of that, that means people are able to justify and use this as to why they're able to put in like particularly oppressive things like legislation that is quite bad, but also it acts as a mechanism for people to self-hate when they have characteristics like that because it is framed around disgust. How does our world fix this? Firstly, obviously an immediate benefit when people stop feeling disgust towards themselves because it means that people feel more open in society. It looks like, for example, queer people coming out, exploring their identity, and just feeling happy because they don't have an inherent feeling of disgust. But also, on a society level, we are able to have things like better regulations or just non-discriminatory legislation because people no longer have the justification justification to do particularly discriminatory legislation because they can't justify things like that. But thirdly, there's probably also a set of people who are trying not to be discriminatory, but because of societal conditioning, often feel like they have contradicting things in their head, meaning that they aren't able to act in a very, very rational manner. Obviously, outside this is when people stop feeling disgust. They may say that some of the reason that people feel disgust is because of inherently because of things like nature, things like that. I think we all reject this because obviously it's not plausible that everything that you feel disgust towards is inherently in nature. For example, think about tech, things like that. There are obviously a lot of things in our society that aren't contingent on being in nature, and yet no one associates them with disgust. We're particularly talking about discriminatory things in our world. Secondly, because I just think that people help consistently. And that is because in the status quo, there are lots of groups of people who are not treated well for things that are physically relevant, I guess. So for example, individuals with physical disabilities, with visible disfigurements and things like that. In the status quo, people want to feel empathy towards these groups of people, of course, but obviously individuals were taught by society to feel disgust in that way, and that just impacted your ability to be kind towards others. And because obviously this disgust is not a legitimate thing, but it stops people from being able to rationalize in the other sense, it also means that initial interactions with people were just going to be much worse. I think that means that we got very good impacts in our world, because obviously in the status quo, these people are dehumanized, and when you are now more part of society, when people no longer feel initial disgust towards you, or an initial interaction, that's pretty bad. But secondly, I think it's just that people help each other out more. That looks like more doctors, because people don't feel squeamish at the sight of blood. When your friends are throwing up or bad things are happening around you, you have an increased capacity to be able to help. And obviously, it's a very good thing if people help more. So that just meant at the end of this that we were able to get more empathy on our world because people didn't have an inherent reaction towards disgusting things. Thirdly, on jobs and why people who are in, kind of gross jobs were able to get impacts on our world. Obviously, important to note up top here that lots of people do have to work jobs that are viewed as being disgusting, for example, working in sewage or garbage or things like that. In the status quo, there are many harms. Firstly, because people project disgust onto people who do these jobs, which is particularly a bad thing. But secondly, to some extent, these jobs are kind of gross, but however, the people who work these jobs don't necessarily have the choice to opt into that. So that at the end of that just means that firstly, we just got better conditions and working conditions for these individuals because they didn't have to contend with that. But secondly, they didn't have the societal view of their job being disgusting. That was probably quite a good thing. Lastly, and quickly to note, is I guess X decrease. I thought that was kind of a good thing. At the end of this though, I think you just get a set of people on our world whose lives are worse off because of disgust who benefited in our world. Firstly, because individuals just feel so much better, but also their lives are improved by each individual interaction that people have with others improving as a whole. Secondly, on why moral judgments are better in our world. A couple things to note up top here. Firstly, society still has an incentive to stop antisocial behavior. That was clearly not something that we were debating here. Secondly, there is also a set of emotions that are associated with harming other people, for example, sadness, guiltiness, etc., which just meant that you weren't gonna which meant that firstly, not having disgust doesn't necessarily mean that society is going to devolve into a wild west where it's going to be lawless. That was obviously a silly claim to make. But secondly, you just probably get more logical thought about morality, and that's because when you have to consider morality without the feeling of disgust inherently present, you have to consult moral principles more and justify the reasons for your reaction more. And that was probably a really good thing because you had to logically think through morality instead of just coming to a rash decision, which can be quite harmful. But thirdly, because we just get more consistency with morality. And that is just to say that some people find some things, maybe cheating or something, quite immoral, and that's inconsistent throughout individual experiences, and that just means that things that people sometimes find disgusting, which is kind of a subjective thing, can be projected onto other things, and that was particularly a bad thing. For example, obviously, if you're in a coercive relationship, perhaps cheating was actually quite a good thing, but obviously, because people judge based on their individual moral experiences, they project that onto others, which can be particularly harmful because this lack of consistency means that some people are viewed as more immoral in some eyes and not in other instances. At the end of this, it meant that firstly in our world, you were able to get better judgments because people firstly had to reason more about the decisions that they came to the reaction, but secondly because they had just had to get like consistency in terms of morality. It was pretty easy to determine what was good and what was bad, probably got better judgments there. But secondly, in society as a whole, it is easier to debate what is moral and what is not moral because people have consistent standards. And I think that's a really good thing because it looks like deciding criminality for particular things just become more consistent as a society and become less debated topics as a whole. They may say that disgust is what stops wrongdoing and that it's particularly bad when you remove these things. 4 responses. Firstly, disgust is something that is felt retroactively. It is not something that is felt before, which means that it was never going to be preventative and was never going to prevent these bad actions from happening in the first place. Secondly, as I already noted on top, people feel other emotions. That just meant that disgust was never the key factor in deciding whether you were going to engage in a moral action. Thirdly, because like really bad actions are likely to still be illegal because morality still exists, obviously. Like for example, murder is bad because it harms people, not because it is inherently disgusting, and that just meant that disgust wasn't going to be the thing that was the key factor to deciding things. But lastly, because you just got lower order and moral behaviors like lying and things like that, probably don't necessarily elicit a disgust response because they are lower order, which just meant that like it didn't really matter whether it was disgust or not, because at the end of this, the more it demonstrates that immorality is judged on a separate metric as compared to disgust. At the end of this, we were able to prove those 2 things, so proud to propose.
I think first affirmative for that speech, and welcome first negative.
Can we okay? Before I start off the speech, shout out to my cookie queen. And to Audrey, it is the last thing I do. I will steal Quinn from you.
That's about
Magnet girl. I think where this affirmative team fails is that they don't prove to you what are the alternative reactions people have in the absence of feeling disgust. Because I would argue, individuals who react to something that they don't like are likely to react in a couple of ways, things such as anger and fear. But why is fear so much worse for things like social justice outcomes? Because now, it's not just that you feel squeamish when you see a trans individual on the tram and move away to a different car, but when you feel anger, you're more likely to project that hostility towards the individual and make them feel actively worse than you would to feel disgust. 2 arguments in this speech. The first is what are the alternatives and why disgust is the better reaction. The first thing to note here is that oftentimes individuals react to things that they don't like in 3 key ways. Firstly, it looks like this is getting angry, where you outwardly project your anger towards other individuals or to other things. But it also feels like feeling things such as fear, where you're scared and you feel like you don't have power over things. But the third thing individuals react to is things like disgust, where you feel squeamish about things and you avoid it and you want to remove that from your side. But crucially, the distinction here is that disgust is something that you're likely to be hyper-specific on, but you do not like that specific thing that you're trying to avoid. Comparatively though, we take things like anger is oftentimes misdirected. Think about it. When you stub your toe on a table, you then get extremely angry and then punch a wall, which means that when you have these kinds of things, there's an immediate reaction that things like anger generate. So you act without thinking and not necessarily linking the thing that is causing that anger or causing that sense of frustration for those individuals. But even things like fear, when you feel like you just don't have control over that situation and you feel like nothing's going to happen. The crucial thing I want to prove here is that disgust is targeting that are extremely specific and is able to link what that disgust is towards. So therefore, I think we're more likely to get more targeted change on our side of the house. The second thing to note here is that disgust is something that is very specifically unique. So therefore, you can push for specific problems that are causing you. And the best example I want to use here is that if you are angry, for example, at a coal company, right? Oftentimes you get angry towards that coal company. If it's disgust, you can directly attribute your frustration towards that coal company. But on that side of the house, when you have things like anger, oftentimes if you get angry at your coal company, you might take that out on things like your family, who have nothing to do with these kinds of things. So therefore, I think that stuff like anger and fear, it poorly directs your frustration to individuals that have nothing to do with what is causing your frustration. What is the overall impact of these things are trying to prove? Is a companion answer in house, it is easier for you to redirect anger towards people or things that are actively trying to harm you. So this is pretty specifically crucial because we think that when you do things, when you rely on things like anger and fear, we think it's very easy for outside institutions, politicians and corporations to redirect that fear towards you. So for example, if you're angry at losing your job, the corporation can say the reasons why you are angry, the reasons why you're doing this is because of the fact that these high taxes the government has and therefore it's easy to redirect those kinds of things. Comparatively though, considering that disgust is far more specific, we think we can specifically attribute that to a corporation. I think that the ability for these institutions to redirect is oftentimes easy. Things such as the media and the narratives they're able to use is often easy to manipulate individuals towards redirecting that anger. The third thing I want to focus on then is why on our side of the house, you're more likely to compare individuals to act. And that is, oftentimes when you feel things like fear, it's very overwhelming. Oftentimes you feel paralysis when you're scared. So therefore, we think disgust on the other hand, when you feel that it's better to avoid things, you're more likely forced towards doing something like change. But the fourth thing I want to point out here is that things like anger and fear are oftentimes extremely taxing on individuals and it's incredibly long lasting. So therefore, you are likely to get incredibly burnt out when you feel things like anger and fear. So your ability to have long-term pressure for change reduces on a thermally world. The two big impacts of this argument then is that one, we think that we're able to specifically target things like disgust for specific actions, but the second thing is that we think we're able to get emotional manipulation, get less manipulation on our side of the house. The second argument then is on food. The first thing I want to point out here is that I'm very angry at Drew for making me run this argument. But the first thing to point out here, the actual first thing to point out here, is that when we look at things like disgust, it isn't just moral disgust, it is active disgust towards things like food. Here's why this disgust is specifically important. Because we think when you feel disgust to things like food, oftentimes you react to eating things such as bad food in a visceral and immediate way. That means you're able to identify things such as when food is bad or food is poison or you feel like this just doesn't work for you, or like when you have an allergic thing, you're likely to have that kind of reaction towards these things. Crucially, and this is why we think that retrospective thing happens, because specifically for ancient humans, considering they didn't have other mechanisms of identifying things, their ability to identify things that have gone bad is specifically important. Because we think on our side of the house, on their side of the house, your inability to identify things like disgust possibly means to eat things like bad food and things like that, which is likely to kill you. And even in the current context, this is important because we think developing countries specifically, they don't have things such as resources that allows you to identify things that whether they've gone bad or whether they're spoiled. Things such as not having enough consistent electricity supply is specifically important things such as refrigeration, your ability to preserve food for a long period of time. Oftentimes, this is not accessible to a significant proportion of society. What is then the impact of this? We think there are a couple of impacts. The first thing to note here is that people then, it's unable for individuals to identify where things have gone bad. So, therefore, you're unlikely to react viscerally to things that you find disgust. Why is this true? The first thing is that without disgust, and you're unable to differentiate between things, you cannot find something that is bad. The second thing is that you don't have an instant reaction to these things. But why is instant reaction to these things specifically important? Because if you bite something or taste something that is specifically disgusting, you feel like you want to spit it out immediately. This is crucial, because on their side, you might feel that this is different to what you're actively tasting. But this is crucial, because we think, if you're eating raw chicken, for example, the difference between, initially tasting a piece of chicken and finding out, okay, I did not cook this well. By the way, all uni students, we've all had that experience. But more often, but if you're able to taste and find that something is bad instead of something that is different, we think that on that side house, the longer you take to realize is particularly harmful. And this is why. Because if you take a longer period of time, you eat more chicken, that increases the point of things like salmonella disease far more likely to occur on that side house. But why? And we think this is specifically important, because if individuals are unlikely to take this, and in specifically developing countries who might be feeling that this is particularly bad, they think that the impact is far more drawn out. The last thing to focus on then is that this impacts the most vulnerable individuals. And this is because oftentimes this exists in a range of instances. So even in developed countries, we think that oftentimes individuals do eat things that are bad. So that visceral reaction is able to protect individuals in developed countries. But more importantly, specifically in individuals like tribes that may not have access to good information that they might try to propagate on their side of the house, they might get affected far more worse. Considering that, for example, you are not able to identify things such as, maybe if it tastes bad, like you shouldn't eat it, or if it tastes, you don't eat it. We think that information is unlikely to get to people like tribesmen and developing countries who may not be able to access those kinds of information. So therefore, we think the most vulnerable are more likely to be affected on the outside house when they eat spoiled food and are likely to contract certain diseases. For all these reasons, we urge you to affirm.
Alright, thank you for that speech. I now welcome the second affirmative, PDA.
Hello. Am I good? We want table space this year also. Okay, awesome. Sorry, I have a serious introduction, so I gotta chill out. Actually, I don't. A world in which people are more accepting of each other's flaws, where someone that meets me for the first time tonight, throwing up around 11:32 p.m., and chooses to pity me rather than turn away, is a much kinder world. It's a world that I want to live in, and I hope we live in it by the end of this debate, and hopefully by 11:32 p.m. tonight. The last thing I'm going to talk about is why kind society is by far the most important impact in this debate. They respond to it in one way by trying to create an odd alternative and setting up an unreasonable counterfactual. But I'm going to do the impacts first, because it's important. The vast amount of interactions that people have in their lives are their first or early interactions with people. They interact with their friends a lot, sure, but every day when I walk down the street, I pass hundreds of people. Those are just a vast amount of more interactions. And we explain where they're more pleasant, people with deformities or disabilities or those that present in ways that don't fit into gender norms feel accepted, or at the very least, do not feel rejected by the people that they see on an everyday basis. And this is really important for two reasons. Firstly, people in both worlds know that their friends accept them for what they look like or who they are inside. That does not change. It's feeling like society and the broader population, the the people who walk past on the street every day do not accept you or view you as disgusting that creates true self-loathing. And most importantly, it robs people of their hope for change. Because when you see everyone around you is against you, when you view your existence as disgusting to the people who walk past on the street every day, your ability to view societal attitudes to change is just incredibly minimal. And secondly, because disgust is perceived and portrayed as innate and unchanging, because it is portrayed as natural, the ways that we explain to you in Emily's introduction, clearly, queer people or people with disabilities feel like these more negative reactions are more changeable than in the alternative world. So if you view it as inherently biological, that someone is opposed to you, or you view it as something that comes from the soul, to view your disability or deformity as disgusting and unacceptable in society, you never view people as having the capacity to change. That is where true self-loathing, that is where true apathy, and that is where the worst impacts of depression for these specific people come about. Feeling like society rejects you as a whole is awful, it is unbelievable, we should never put people through it. That is clearly why affirmative wins this debate. These vast majority of interactions in the world around you is just more accepting. But secondly, I want to take a moment here to talk about people's capacity for change. Because older people, for instance, currently, right now, their societies have progressed past them. They might have older conservative ideas. They were raised in more conservative societies. They were raised by more conservative parents. They might still have those innate reactions of disgust. People whose current childhoods have been conservative, but now are in a progressive society and want to have a capacity for change, still have those internal reactions that we explain are the hardest to reject from yourself, but they're internal because you feel that they are biological. Firstly, they actually change when disgust is removed because you just are less mean in the first place. You do react in ways which are acceptable. Because even if you are actively policing yourself, your small reaction when you have disgust is something that is hard to dry out, right? It's hard to drive out, and obviously if you just remove it in the first place, that's better. It means I don't get a small expression of disgust on my face when I see someone that I actually want to have a productive relationship with or want to talk to. That person is clearly just far better able to change on the outside, because they feel like they could eventually be accepted by the people that they're trying to bridge a barrier with. But secondly, and more importantly, they just continue to try. Because you don't feel like it is unchanging to yourself, you don't feel like your body is rejecting your attempts to improve yourself, you are just more likely to continue to try and do it, to keep educating yourself, to be intellectually and morally curious in your age and in your youth. And these people changing is what truly changes societal attitudes, and that is what creates the institutional and structural change, which we tell you is the most important thing in tonight's debate. They say other emotions that are worse to replace it. It's things like anger or fear that are alternative reactions. Few responses to this. Firstly, we just explained that disgust comes before these reactions. It is visceral. It is a revulsion against what you see before you. It is a revulsion against what you don't understand. And then it is your own discomfort, your own frustration that causes you to have reactions of anger and fear after that. Because it's your internal reaction that then informs your reaction of anger. Because if I am disgusted by something, if I view it as threatening or unnatural or weird, that is when my anger arises a natural means of protecting myself, or as something that I could react against the other person for. We explained that disgust is a precursor to those emotions, not something which can be easily substituted out from them. But also, obviously, disgust can be a very small emotion that you feel in a lot of circumstances. Anger is a very strong emotion, which just means you need a far higher barrier to act on it. Even if I feel a small amount of anger, I'm not likely to act on it individually, and if it's something like violence, as they describe it, you're especially unlikely to. Society frowns on that so heavily, but when it's a small emotion of disgust, I don't register it often, I don't know that I reacted in a disgusted way, but I still treat the people around me differently. We explain that that's where the harm accrues. But secondly, people are just far better at interrogating and challenging your own anger. Because we work backwards. Because anger makes us do worse things, in more circumstances, we think about why we're angry, we challenge it more often during our youth and during our childhood. That means we have better emotional responses to it. But where a conservative society and conservative movements tell people that their disgust is mysterious, natural, or even divine, people just challenge it less in their childhood because they view it as something that shouldn't be morally thought through or something that is unchangeable in itself. We're better at challenging anger, we're better at challenging fear. Disgust is unnatural, it is viewed as mysterious, it is something which is a precursor. For these reasons, it obviously can't replace it in the debate. I think that material falls out. And that impacting that I did at the very start of my speech, then which is clearly accrues here. Because you treat people kinder, because there is more capacity to change, because of all the reasons that we tell you that are unresponded to, people that have disgusting jobs have better lives, people treat them differently, maybe they advocate for them to be paid higher, and help people out in times of need, help people who don't have a disgusted reaction. For example, when you see a homeless person on the street, you're more likely to help them, you're more likely to have empathy to them, to reach out to them. That is incredibly important. And finally, it is just kind of important that people don't have relationship X. I know this seems like a low quality issue, but a lot of people reject people who put otherwise be very fulfilling partners for them in the future. Very small reasons at first. If you give people more chances, then eventually things are going to stick. Maybe you project a bunch of people who could actually be really productive partners and give you good times in your life. Obviously, that is something that we support. I'm really glad that I have 2 minutes to respond to the food argument at the end of this case, because it's really fucking fun. But obviously there are other things that discuss which inform your aversion to moldy food or to disgusting food. And more importantly, I guess in the really engaging with this charitably, you can logically intuit it backwards. Which means even if I'm disgusted by it, I know that when the milk is solid or when it's chunky, I probably shouldn't drink it. Well, I guess not drink it, eat it. You know what I mean? Secondly, if it has green spots on the food, I also can probably logically ensure that I shouldn't have it, even if I'm not disgusted by it in the first place. But thirdly, maybe in our case, under the worst circumstances, a couple people die because they don't have the instant first reaction. In that case, we probably just do have things like stronger regulation because we consider it as more necessary to stop people from consuming moldy food in the first place. You get better food standards authority. That's pretty good because it prevents people from having to make the judgment themselves. If I'm drunk and I see chunky milk, I don't know, I might be great at making that decision. The last thing I'm going to go here is actually this can broaden people's zest for life. If you try food with more variety, that's actually really fucking good, right? Like people have disgusted reactions to cuisines from other cultures that they don't like. For example, obviously if you're more likely to try something like Indian food, which is fucking awesome on the outside of the case, then that is clearly a large benefit. Okay, last thing I'm going to note is just there is actual racist elements which can be incorporated and discussed in the first place. I don't know if any of you guys followed that one, PhD professor on Twitter, Dr. Ali Lewis. It is really cool. People's politics of smell can inform the ways in which they react to other people. People's racism can manifest in disgust, and people's racism can be justified by disgust. There's an inherent reaction towards certain groups of people or towards certain cultures. It can be weaponized. You rob conservatives of their biggest weapon. We're creating a kind of society. A society in which it is better to live in. And a society in which you try really, really good types of food. I am so, so proud of you.
For my speech, I just want to give a quick, sloppy introduction because one, that's the nature of our debate community in Vietnam, but also I send a lot of my friends and families the videos to the live stream, so they're gonna do things that I'm right now and punch me when I get back to Vietnam. So just in case. Alright, so first of all, to my friends in Vietnam, thank you, the Colosseum Debate Club. This was my high school debate club. You guys make me who I am right now. Obviously, the ANU Debate Club, I'm gonna thank you guys later. Hello, friends, families, you know who you are, you know who you are. So lastly, my girlfriend Yang, I love you so much. I think you know that. Alright, take it off. Take it off to my Australian friends. First, all of you here listening to me yapping for next 8 minutes is already big yay for me. So thank you all. Thank you all specifically to ANU Debate Society. Love you guys all. You guys teach me a lot. I'm not strange as international students now because of you guys. Lastly, to my teams, Drew, Devon, crazy teammates, good. Oh wait, sorry, lastly, Chelsea. Thank you really much for your advice. I promise you that much. Thank you. Devon forgot, bad Devon. I'm gonna do it. Alright. I'm pretty sure laugh. Alright, cool. When you're a kid, you're gonna have to crawl, and then you're gonna have to walk, and then you can run. Things gonna have to be done in step by step. Nothing can be changed radically. If they don't really change radically, two things can happen. One, the change might never happen in the first end because of how there's a high barrier for entry, like on the outside creating this debate. Two, the moment they are entry to that barrier, there's an unlikely chance that you're gonna be able to de-escalate. This looks like a lot of social narratives that are being enforced into stone is not gonna be de-escalated on their side of the house. Here's how in the era right now, it's unfortunate that we are having people being discussed and transgender. Here's how in the last 500 years or something, if you come out as gay, you're being stoned to death. That's the comparative thing I have to defend in this debate. It's not only about like just you're gonna be a normal human person. You're gonna be filled with anger. First of all, on like this kind of social movement and this kind of narrative. Second of all, on this kind of morality and soft morality. Lastly, on like some misunderstanding stuff, might include some food in that as well. One, on this kind of like LGBT kind of plus community and voice shaming whatsoever. Hey, notice how this still happens in both sides of the house regardless. This is how majority of these stuff are being set in stone because of one, religious leader and religion itself, as in a narrative from thousands of years before, which is set in stone just like now. It's really hard for you to change any of it. Second of all, these are also being backed by the superiority of the narrative of God as well, which is really hard for you to opt out of this kind of stuff. Third of all, is a societal norm of the past of you have to actually have children to perform. So therefore, those kind of societal norms already exist in the past when you're a caveman and you have survival instinct, because that's the only way you can be human as you are right now, because in the past, if that's not the case, you would die, and you would get instinct. So therefore, these kind of narratives are already set in stone. They never explain to us in this debate why disgust is the only reason why we have homophobia and whatsoever. First on their side of the house, one, this kind of religious leader and also conservative politicians still have the incentive to antagonize these kind of gay people. So how they want, that's the way they're gaining political agenda from their side of the house. So two, that's the way they're advocating for the religious doctrine, right? So therefore, it's a symmetry analysis to happen both sides of the house. But right now, because how there's no middle set of disgust, majority of the tactics that are going right now is one, fear-mongering. That's going to be happening even more. So how they're going to be trying their best to actually fear-monger you. So compared to their side of the house, they would see that you're disgust and that's the end that they're going to do. But even if they cannot force you, basically they cannot force you to the end on the outside of the house. Even if we have less people being like we have less people being comparatively. So therefore, in that side of the house, we've managed to prove that they have more radical analysis and radical change in the end, we also win. So second of all, why does this mean that their side of the house people are going to be getting more radical? Second of all, people are getting to be anger mongering as well. So how they got like conservative people are trying their best to push on now like trans women right now are competing with women, and therefore they're really bad. They are being redirected by hatred toward yourself. This is how there's no middle step of disgust. You are more or less likely to move toward the end of the spectrum, which is basically hatred. So therefore, anger and hatred exists more on their side of the house. This manifests into a variety of analysis. One, it's harder for you to actually get radical changes because of A, the burden to get change is higher. This is not only changes on the society and legislative change, which is I think is intuitive enough. This is how you're harder for you to actually get policy change, voting, campaign, and also because how you have less buy-in less out of the house. And so on the outside of the house, you are treating these kind of people as relatively harmless. When you're being disgusted to a trans woman, you're just basically going to walk past her and just don't have a good favor of her image. You are not actually like staying there and criticize her for a longer amount of time. So you're more likely to buy into a more like nuances amount of idea and nuances amount of social movement. Notice how this is the way we get radical momentum of social movement built up to actually get radical changes we have nowadays. But also second of all, it's hard for you as a they're saying like, oh, like in society, like in natural interaction, when you only meet someone in the first time, it's going to be bad. I do agree with this, but one, it's worse for you outside the house and you have to interact with other people in the long run and they are angry against you. This looks like your family. They don't accept you even more. So rather than just disgust, they are anger and they are angry at you because how you're already going against a lot of that indoctrination. They're going against that old belief to a further radical extent. This affects you much more because these are people you are spending majority of your time and your life in. You are depending on these kind of people to a certain extent. Your boss is, you're depending on your boss to get money. You're depending on your government to get any legislative change. You depend on your family to get any mental health and any monetary change, any education, any healthcare in general. So therefore, trans women, trans people, like any LGBT plus or any people in general are getting discriminated much worse on their side of the house. This will be on the scope of how they're going to be this first interaction. If this first interaction impact is relatively small, it just you don't even voice out that now because your fear of cancel culture as it is right now as something that's being discussed by society. So therefore, it is the majority of the stuff. So therefore, now, second of all, analysis here is worse campaigning as well. So how you also as a minority feel more anger compared comparatively, you're more likely to push for more radical changes. This looks like the Black Lives Matter movement afterward, but there's a lot of black people who are not only is pushing for and advocating for the legislative change, but doing more weird stuff as like thieves, stealing things, raping all stuff, causing more burden to be placed on the social movement as well. This is how the anger on you is bottom up, and you'll feel bad more on their side of the house, and to the extent they have to defend these instances. So therefore, most instances, you have to let changes on their side of the house. Second, on morality, the reason that right now we're having a lot of like instances against incest, rape, kidnapping, and pedophile is because we are disgusted against them. One, that's how our society are misogynistic to a certain extent, which means that rape in the past was not considered a really bad thing. That's how people don't feel actively angry at rape. That's how they think this is a normal thing. There's no the entry barrier was never achieved. On the outside of the house, people get momentarily more disgusted comparatively, and then to a certain extent, when there's an actual movement right now because of amount of people in it, they can actually be changed, being pushed because of how people in that instance is the only way that they can be angry at this. Notice how right now, if I ask a random human person on the street, why do you dislike incest? It's really hard for them to give the answer to it because how these are soft morality. It's hard for you to concretize this kind of analysis and a reason for you having this morality. On the outside of the house, this kind of discussing is a good different way to defer this kind of act. This is how you just basically don't want to do it. You don't want to opt into this act. You are encouraging people to not opt into this act. You are having a lower burden of proof to not passing through campaign and whatsoever these kind of acts well. Even if that's not the case, momentum. So therefore, in the end, morality is also actually better achieved on outside the house. Thirdly, on then poor people, developing people. This is including food as well. But first of all, on dirty jobs, I think there's no nonsense on the phone which is actually compelling enough. I want to flip this argument. There's three arguments right here. One, these are those jobs that are having enough you're doing right now because this is proportionate to the value being placed in society. There's a lot of society right now think these kind of jobs are not valued enough to pay them well. Second of all, these people are exposed to bad things like germs, like waste, like all the stuff that can get them to bad health whatsoever. Instantly, they should be disgusted at this instance because of how that's the way to protect themselves. That's the way that we get people to actually wear like protective stuff on their side of the house. This is how people are also risk averse as well. Also, second of all, this means that more people being disgusted, this means less people doing this job. Supply, demand of labor, higher wage right now. We're seeing Australia is the prime example of this. So therefore, people are actually being reparated to that extent that's actually good. Lastly, on these kind of just like food and just wasted. Notice how these kind of instances are two vulnerable people. One, poor people, poor university students as well. You're more risk averse because how if you just open your fridge, no regulation for your fridge as well. If you see like a bad milk and you don't have any money, chances are you would drink that milk if you don't feel disgusted and that's like enough. So that's a low barrier for you because you are really hard to feel anger or feel fear. You're more risk averse then. Therefore, all the impact actually manifests more outside the house. In the end, no rape, better movement, better people, better morality. Both negative.
Thank you for that speech. I now welcome to wrap up the debate for the affirmative team, the third affirmative.
Can people hear me? Yeah, awesome. Dear God, my life would be so much easier if every time someone I thought I was developing a crush on gave a mid-debating speech and I didn't experience the ick watching that. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, on what the alternative likely is. Secondly, on morality. And thirdly, on kindness. Firstly, on alternative. What is the alternative is today? The first thing I want to do is cut out some of the stuff that we hear about social movements under their side of the house. Social movements are still likely to experience anger and things that push the movement forward in positive ways because the things that social movements are trying to push for are not underpinned by disgust. People do not experience disgust and discrimination. They experience sympathy and empathy for people who are experiencing the consequences of that discrimination. As I'm going to explain later, disgust actually probably turns people away from social movements, but I'll deal with that in a second. Their other push then is to say that when people are are being discriminatory, the alternative things that they might experience are stuff like anger and fear. But you have to ask the question, where do these things like anger and fear come from in the first place? Anger and fear exist towards people you feel disgusted by because you are angry at the fact that they have imposed a harm on you by making you feel physically disgusted and having to deal with the large consequences of that. Same for fear. You fear having to deal with the physical experience of being disgusted, and therefore that is where those things come from in the first place. So they have this harm in the status quo, where disgust prompts these extra actions, and we explain that without disgust, you also treat people better as well. They don't really identify an alternative reason as to why people would dislike queer people, for example, aside from just saying that as we identified in Emily, we preempted that it could be that people dislike things that go against nature. But we would just point out, things like technology could be against religion, or kind of are against religion in the status quo. But technology is cool and awesome, and people don't experience disgust using it. So they're happy to move past those kind of past instincts they might have had towards disliking them. Maybe more people have gay sex on the outside of the house, realize it's super cool and awesome and fun, and have the same reaction that they do with technology. Then they say, oh, well, it could be entrenched by religion. But I'll note their argument about food presumes this is a retrospective debate, which means therefore that religion wouldn't have identified these things in the first place. But even if you do think that it's a retrospective debate, two things to respond. Firstly, religion just has far less to draw upon when it tries to make people feel disgusted in the first place. So status quo religion is particularly powerful because people associate disgust with morality in so many circumstances, so therefore when religion points out these things are against those religions, people therefore react accordingly. But secondly, we just posit that in the status quo religion is in general losing power. That's still really bad for them on their side of the house, because people are less religious, but they've still grown up in these societies with entrenched religion, so still experience disgust, even if they become less religious. I feel like there's like a stereotype of like a 40 or 50-year-old woman who wants to become more accepting towards other people, but who just cannot do it to the same degree because they still experience the disgust they were raised with in childhood. And it stops them from being able to be as progressive as they would like to be in those circumstances. But also, of course, when religion is losing power, the hold that they have over people alternatively does decrease, and so they're able to get benefits there. Then finally, to say that in some circumstances there might be other instances. So they say things like, oh, well, people might still perceive trans women as competition with cis women, for example, and therefore they would still dislike them in that circumstance. But I think that it's just not the reason the majority of people are actually transphobic. People find that justification after they experience the initial disgust to make it seem like it's something that is more justified. But also, of course, even if you still believe that, there's a very, very minor piece of mitigation in this debate. In the vast majority of circumstances, they cannot draw across those same sorts of justifications. So that is why the alternative is not things like anger and fear, it's instead things like compassion and empathy, which we set up at first here and we don't really get any engagement from. They cannot prove a harm in this debate if they do not engage with that as the comparative. Secondly, on morality, we explain that there is a difficulty in having moral conversations right now because people react with disgust and they do not necessarily understand the underlying reasons why they think things are good or bad. We explain that is really problematic at Emily because you just end up with really inequitable reactions that people have towards different sorts of like potentially immoral things that people would do, because people do have idiosyncratic at times reactions of disgust towards people. So that means the types of moral judgment you might pass upon someone who does something that you find really disgusting, like cheating on someone, is not necessarily commensurate to the actual moral harm they've perpetrated. And this can happen across a lot of things, but just results in people being quite confused as to the way other people are treating them, or means that people go through unjust impacts for the result of actions that aren't actually particularly immoral in the first place. On the outside of the house, we explain it and links no response that you actually have to interrogate why you find things bad in the first place. I've tried to give some examples of this, but maybe something people feel disgust towards a relationship between like ugly men and hot women, perhaps they actually have to think about maybe the power dynamics that they think exist behind that circumstance. Sorry to my parents if they're watching the live stream, but there are actually good philosophical reasons to explain that incest is probably not actually immoral in and of itself. People actually have to think about those and debate about them instead of just justifying them on the basis of the disgust that they feel in those circumstances. Their push about morality is to say that crimes and things like rape become more common because people are less likely to feel disgust. But as we explained to you in Emily's speech as well, there are still a set of reasons why people do not want to harm other people or identify harms that have been done to them, which is that you still feel the other pain that people feel, you still feel sympathetic and guilt in many instances. So it is just unlikely, and also you still have illegality and stuff like this. Disgust is not the factor that stops people from committing crimes, as well because it's something that happens after the fact. Finally, on kindness, I think this is where we really clearly win the debate. We identified a set of different instances in which people are more kind towards each other. Firstly, we identified that in the status quo, a lot of people experience rejection on a daily basis in society just because of the way they look. In particular, people with physical deformities are actually, I think a lot of people do want to be empathetic and sympathetic towards people they can identify have disabilities because they know they live a really tough life, but then still have that instinct mitigated by the fact they personally experience disgust when interacting with that person. And so even when they do try to do good things, they do it in bad ways, like avoiding eye contact or trying to shorten conversation with people. It just makes people with these characteristics feel really alienated from the rest of society. So obviously when people do not feel disgusted, that is the same way. We also expect that similarly is beneficial for people with undesirable jobs, people who live in poverty and circumstances that people typically view as disgusting, who now are not treated as disgusting because people do not have that same instinct to do things like smell and the clothes that someone's wearing and physical brine as indication of someone's morality or worth. They say, well, in circumstances like garbage and sewage conditions, you would get less money in these circumstances. But we would say this is probably fine and straight. The reason why you get more money is because it's a disgusting job. If the job is less disgusting and you don't dislike it as much, it's maybe okay if people are paid slightly less there. More people are willing to do that job in the first place. We would also point out that still like to do things like get safety stuff and stuff like that, or pay people more, because the job might still be unsafe in some circumstances. So it's unlikely to be a huge amount of reduction in pay. So, second, people who experience rejection right now have much better lives because people actually engage with them as human beings. The second thing we identified, though, is things like policy. We just explained that it makes people much more willing to support social change to the point at which they don't view things as disgusting. When you don't feel people of another race as disgusting, when you don't view queer people as disgusting, when you don't view poor people as disgusting, you're much more willing to try and campaign on these sorts of things. They tell you that disgust compels a reaction in many circumstances. Seeing someone's position being really bad means you might be more likely to try and help them. But I think that's actually not true. I think disgust compels people to turn away from those who need it most. I think an example of this is many of you might have gone to Vietnam World and gone to the Museum of the American War there. The top floor of that museum is a bunch of pictures of kids with deformities as a result of the use of Agent Orange in the Vietnam War. Many people just do not go into that room in the first place because the disgust it prompts in them having to look at these images that are quite difficult to engage with just means that they don't want to see them in the first place. So on their side of the house, people turn away from the most gruesome examples because they make them feel uncomfortable. So they're just less educated and less likely to act on social issues that they care about in the first place. The final thing we explained to you is that you experience personal disgust in many circumstances. And that is just a huge benefit on the outside of the house. If people don't feel disgust imposed upon them, they can explore their identity much earlier, they just feel far happier while they're alive. Also at the end of this debate, we prove that we get the kind of society who can also be very kind to me and not make me lose the third grand final from affirmative. Please vote for us.
Alright, thank you for that speech. I now welcome to deliver the final speech of EASTERS 2025, the third negative.
This is the issue with writing a speech on both sides of the paper. As in, like, from a different debate. So I was.
Oh. Pay attention, kids watching the recording. It's a good lesson.
Before I begin, obviously, to make this quick so we can all get to the social and start having a good time. Firstly, I'm just going to thank my family, my parents who are watching this, and my brother who's probably on shift because he's a doctor and he's incredible and he's currently not getting as best conditions as he can. Shout out to all of them for their support, and shout out to the Indian Dating Society for being the best society that we have, and all the people who both online are supporting, in person have supported me, and have gotten me to this point. I am forever grateful. When I was younger, I used to hate pickles. And if you know anything about Indian cuisine, you'll know that pickles are a pretty essential part. I used to think they were bitter, I used to think they were weird, and I didn't want to eat them at all. But naturally, like the good mother my mother is, she forced me to eat them at every single meal. And slowly after time, the bitterness did not seem so bad. It seemed accepting, and I learned to instead enjoy the fact it gave me a taste and break for the other food that I was eating. And in that same way, disgust is something that can fade over time with exposure. As you slowly realize that maybe this thing isn't so bad, as you slowly realize that it is normal and completely fine for you to experience that, you're far less likely to retain onto that disgust as time goes on. Which is why, for example, people who maybe previously had voted against the plebiscite eventually were fine with same-sex marriage as time went on, because of the fact that they just saw more gay people in society, they saw more representation, and said, you know what, this is okay, this is fine, and this is completely normal. And you lose that on their side when it's linked with anger. The first question I'm going to ask is, how do people feel disgust? The second question I'm going to ask is, what is the better emotion? The first thing though I actually want to do is with this food stuff, because I'm actually really happy about this stuff. It's obviously in the instance where this debate is retrospective, which this team concedes both at first and third could be an interpretation of this debate, then that necessarily needs to be instantly with. Because that just means that people very long ago would not be able to identify when food was bad or wrong, because the visual indicators that this seems to suggest obviously wouldn't have existed. So maybe you thought something was kind of smelled bad. Like people still drank alcohol, for example, when it was bitter initially, and then eventually learned they didn't die from that. In the same way, on their side, you would, for example, see those same smells. You would identify the difference between a sour piece of meat and a sour piece of food. You would eat that, you would die, humanity probably exists. I think humanity is pretty good. But the second observation I would make is, even if you do not believe this is retrospective, obviously that's still a pretty big harm, because a lot of people do not have access to things like regulation, like for example, basic food preservation like they on their side. I'm sure there are a ton of tribes that are just instantly decimated by this because they choose to live by traditional values. What do they suggest? One, there are other indicators. Yes, sometimes there are other indicators, sometimes they aren't. Like blue cheese explicitly has mold, and yet, for example, it is still fine to eat. Often those indicators are misleading, or for example, you cannot see them, like, you don't look in the carton milk before you drink the solid stuff. The second thing is that you say you get stronger regulation. Like if you get stronger regulation, that concedes that people will die on their side. But also it's unclear necessarily why the regulations like regulation happens across the board. The last thing they say different cuisines are pretty good. Sure, but I think I would be willing to trade off, like, maybe, like firstly, I think exposure to different cuisines means that people will eventually do it. Like another person saying that, oh, actually Asian food is pretty good means you can try it. Likewise, alternatively. Secondly, and less importantly, let's discuss how people feel disgust. The first thing that they suggest is that disgust is not innate, and down the bench says that there are other reasons why. And we agree. But the problem is they never explain where that disgust comes from, if it is not an innate biological emotion. Where does it come from? And we suggest it comes from external factors. It comes from your upbringing. It comes from what your parents tell you. It comes from what your religion tells you. And obviously the cause of that is symmetric, right? Like on both sides, you would still likely have those questions. The question then is how they manifest. So it's not on their side they do not experience that disgust. Instead they discuss in other manifestations, because your parents still tell you, for example, it is bad to be gay and you ought to hate gay people, if you believe their own argument, which is that disgust is not innate. Secondly, though, we would explain that anger is linked to morality, which means that people are more likely to feel that harm on their side. So that is, if no one is born homophobically, then that means that, for example, you experience some sort of what's it called, like cognitive dissonance, right? Like your parents are telling you it is bad to be gay, but you do not feel that inherently, because biologically you do not feel that disgust unless it is imposed on you. Which means, for example, you're more likely to question that. On their side, if it is, for example, taught you in the same way that parents teach you emotions and morality and fundamental building blocks of how you consciously think about things, those are the sorts of things that are far more likely to be shaped by them, and therefore far more likely to be worse and manifest on their side. Because the lack of disgust indicates that perhaps you might support this and maybe you might be more willing to engage in such a thing. The second thing they say is that you learn not to be mad about things. So if your alternative is anger, you learn not to be mad about things after specific points in time. One, the problem with anger is that anger is part of your identity. You make it an essential part of your lived experience, and you make it a part of yourself, which means you refuse to let it go. Why? Firstly, because of the fact that I think there's a lot of media that suggests, we all need revenge and stuff like that. But secondly, anger lingers and sticks. Material given to you at first, you can't respond to you. It's an emotion that exists continuously. For example, just because I see something that makes me angry, doesn't mean 30 minutes later I do not still feel that angry emotion. On their side, the disgust fades away, which means that anger is far more likely to become part of your identity and something you constantly go back to, which means you're more likely to exit out of disgust on our side, while on their side, you choose to remain into that anger and onto those same emotions. The second thing though, we suggest on anger, is it becomes a moral duty for you to do so. Because anger becomes linked with morality, rather than an instinctive reaction to yourself, it means that it's your moral duty to feel anger. And importantly, it means that you have to, for example, opt into it. The moment, for example, you stop hating gay people, you say, wait, this is immoral. My parents told me I ought not do this, and then you break yourself for doing that, and I'm more likely to enter into that. On the other side, you just naturally fade away as you gain more access and exposure towards people, which means that you're far more likely to become better. Which means necessarily, on the other side, you're far more likely to opt out of the instances in which people, for example, force upon morality on you, which is where most of your decisions and most of your life is actioned upon. And we explain that these are the places that all of the bad things they want to identify manifest. Things like homophobia, things like transphobia, things like racism are built by the structures around you. It is built by your government, it is built by the media, it is built by your family, which means the side that is best able to avoid those initial instances and therefore not internalize those emotions because of the fact you can rationally debate with, because of the fact you oppose them on a biological level, means that is the side that opened this debate. And that is why we explain to you, for example, you do not get the worst instances of discrimination on the R side. What do they say in response to this? The first thing, the main thing they say, perhaps to respond to this final thing, is that religion religion is not necessarily the main factor here. Firstly, because religion lacks. I actually don't know what that says. Religion lacks power under the status quo. Firstly, that is obviously not relevant in the vast majority of societies. For example, think about the power that conservative Christians currently have in the United States, one of the most secular countries in the world, in contrast to the vast majority of the world that is religious. The second thing they say is that religion loses power over time. The problem with that, though, is that obviously at the point where it becomes a logical decision that you opt into, you're far more likely to make worse decisions. Weight is incredibly highly. Because this is a fundamental, this analysis applies to everything, That place about kindness obviously is contingent on this. Because if disgust is entirely built by your society, we explain that you're far less likely to go with the natural human response, which we do naturally think is empathy. We don't think humans are inherently bad to one another. We do think people inherently want to love one another. And it's on our side you're more likely to be able to counter that than on their side, where, for example, you enter into because we have the last of the sons. Let's secondly talk about what is better emotion. And I want to emphasize all the material I'm responding to my first speaker. Because we explain that anger is far more likely to be worse for a set of fear, is far more likely to be worse for a set of reasons. The fact that anger can be very easily manipulated because it is all encompassing and it lingers, which means you do not direct it as the exact person. You often lash out at people that you love, very much unintentionally. You get annoyed by a mark you get at school, and then you yell at your mother when she was trying to be kind to you and told that you did well. Those are the things that are far more likely to hurt people and happen on a daily basis. How many times have you gotten mad at a friend completely unnecessarily and they felt it was something that was their fault? On our side, instead, if you did not feel that angry, if instead that emotion was somewhat replaced by disgust for certain things. For example, you did not feel this, you felt disgust instead at the range of injustices that occur in the world. You're far more likely than less likely than to take out that anger on other people. But secondly, it's far less likely that people direct that to other people. That way, people, for example, can't say it is the government you all say for taxing us, which is why we had to pollute this river. Instead, you target that corporation and you individually look towards them and make sure that they cannot squirm out of that. The thing they say on this is that you do not act how that was. Firstly, obviously there are a range of instances in which you do the worst instances, for example, things like hate crime, for example, things like protesting, worst instances. Secondly, things like protesting obviously cause similarly under this, which means you're less likely to act out. The second thing, the last thing is just is that disgust leads to anger. But I think that is a relative assertion, and I think we explain specifically where it is more likely to come from, which is those set of fundamental beliefs. We just explained that in most instances, humans want to love one another, and the question is whether on their side you rationalize that hatred at every single instance, or whether a biological urge tells you to move above that, be better than your parents, and make a better society.
Well done to everyone. Can I get another big round of applause?